On Norway's rugged west coast, where the fjords meet the North Sea, a small island would hold for nearly 3 decades the secret of one of the most controversial crimes in modern Scandinavian history. In Karmøy, the name Birgitte Tengs became synonymous not only with a young life brutally cut short, but also with the perilous line between science and speculation in the pursuit of justice. This is the story of a crime that led to 2 wrongful convictions over 28 years, a case in which the world's most advanced DNA technology failed to deliver the truth, where mathematicians devised revolutionary models that seemed infallible, and yet human bias corrupted even the most sophisticated scientific evidence. Birgitte Tengs was just 17 years old when her life was savagely ended on a May night in 1995. What followed was a judicial saga that first condemned an innocent cousin on the back of a forced confession, then imprisoned another man based on irrefutable DNA, only to discover that even science can lie when filtered through prejudice. This is not merely a story of an unsolved murder. It is a stark warning about the limits of forensic technology, about how our obsession with scientific certainty can blind us to the complexity of reality, and how the desperate hunt for justice can, ironically, entrench injustice. If you want to understand how the most advanced forensic science can fail spectacularly, and why this case forever changed the way we interpret DNA evidence, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel and switch on notifications to follow this investigation that challenges everything we thought we knew about scientific justice.
Karmøy stretched out like a protective arm along Norway's west coast, shielding the inner fjords from the wild North Sea. With only 30,000 residents spread across centuries-old fishing communities, it was a sort of place where everyone knew one another, where front doors were left unlocked and where violent crime was virtually unheard of. For Birgitte Tengs, born in 1978, Karmøy was simply home. At 17, she embodied modern Norwegian youth, bright, independent, brimming with plans for the future. A diligent student at the local secondary school, Birgitte was known for her radiant smile and outgoing nature. Like many teenagers, she dreamt of university, of traveling the world, of all the endless possibilities adulthood might bring. Friday, 5th of May 1995, began like any other spring day in Karmøy. The Scandinavian sun lingered late into the evening, as it does in the far north. Birgitte spent the day at school, then met friends in the town of Kopervik, the island's commercial center. By around 10 o'clock that evening, Birgitte Tengs was walking along the familiar streets of her childhood, heading home after a quiet night out with friends. It was a journey she had taken countless times, just a few kilometers along well-lit country roads, linking the town center to the residential area where her family lived. In the hours before, she had been seen by several acquaintances. A schoolmate, also 17, spotted her on Kopervik's main street and greeted her with a friendly hug. A casual exchange between two who had known each other since childhood. To everyone who saw her that night, Birgitte seemed cheerful, speaking eagerly about plans for the weekend and the summer holidays to come. But somewhere along that short familiar walk home, Birgitte Tengs' life was brutally stolen. On one of the rural lanes she knew so well, someone attacked her with a ferocity that would shock even seasoned investigators. At around 6 o'clock the following morning, 6th May 1995, a local man out for his usual walk made a discovery that would change Karmøy forever. Birgitte Tengs' body lay in a ditch beside the road, just 2 kilometers from her home. The scene told its own devastating story. She had been assaulted and murdered. The first response team arrived swiftly. For officers accustomed to petty thefts and the odd bar fight, the scene was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Birgitte had suffered horrific injuries indicating both sexual assault and homicide. The body's location suggested the attacker knew the area well. This was no random act by a stranger passing through. Norwegian forensic technicians immediately began processing the scene with the tools available in 1995. Every detail was photographed, soil samples collected, clothing fibers gathered, any physical trace that might help. Crucially, they recovered biological material from Birgitte's tights. At the time, DNA analysis was still in its relative infancy. Though the technique existed and was in use in more advanced countries, Norway's technology was limited. Experts confirmed male biological material was present but could not extract a usable profile. The samples were carefully preserved in the hope that future advances might unlock their secrets. The post-mortem revealed the full extent of Birgitte's ordeal. She had been brutally assaulted before being killed. The cause of death was head trauma from blows with a blunt object. The injuries suggested either extreme rage or sadism. This was no mere opportunistic crime spiraling out of control. For the Tengs family, the loss was unfathomable. Hard-working, respected members of the community, they suddenly found themselves at the center of a national tragedy. Birgitte was their only child, the focus of their hopes and dreams. Her death not only shattered their private world, but shook an entire community to its core. In the days following the discovery, Karmøy changed overnight. The island's sense of safety evaporated. Parents began collecting their children from school. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly bolted with chains and multiple locks, and suspicion seeped into everyday interactions. Under intense pressure from national media and the devastated local community, police vowed to catch Birgitte's killer. A dedicated task force was set up, seasoned investigators brought in, and hundreds of locals interviewed. Anyone who had seen or spoken to Birgitte in the weeks before her death was questioned. Lists of every person with a criminal record in the area, however minor, were compiled. But as days turned to weeks and weeks into months, the investigation began to stall. Despite thousands of man-hours, hundreds of interviews, and painstaking analysis of every possible lead, Birgitte's killer remained unknown. The DNA evidence was maddeningly inconclusive, and no one had witnessed the crime itself. The pressure on investigators was immense. Norwegian media covered the case relentlessly, the local community demanded answers, and Birgitte's grieving parents pleaded for justice. In such a climate, decisions were made that would later prove disastrous. As 1995 became 1996 and 1996 gave way to 1997, the Birgitte Tengs investigation had become one of the most intense in Norwegian modern history. But it had also grown increasingly desperate, where the clamor for results began to cloud judgment, leading to some of the most controversial decisions ever taken in Norwegian law enforcement. The 17-year-old who walked home on that spring night had become more than a victim. She had now become at the center of a case that would test the limits of forensic science, the integrity of the justice system, and the very meaning of truth in an age where technology promises answers it cannot always deliver.
In February 1997, nearly 2 years after the murder of Birgitte Tengs, the pressure on the Norwegian police had become unbearable. The media questioned the competence of the investigation daily. The community of Karmøy lived in a constant state of suspicion and fear, and Birgitte's parents publicly begged for justice for their murdered daughter. It was in this climate of growing desperation that investigators turned their attention to someone who had been on the periphery since the beginning, Birgitte Tengs' cousin, then 19 years old. The young man was not an obvious suspect. He was a respected university student with no criminal record, known in the community as polite and hardworking. His only connection to the crime was biological. He was Birgitte's cousin. But in an investigation that had exhausted most other leads, even the thinnest connections began to seem significant. The cousin had been questioned several times during the first months of the investigation, just like all other family members and close friends of Birgitte. On each occasion, he had fully cooperated, provided clear alibis for the night of the murder, and showed what seemed to be genuine grief over the loss of his cousin. But for investigators under extreme pressure, his family proximity to the victim gradually shifted from incidental circumstance to growing suspicion. The decision to intensify the focus on the cousin was influenced by several factors that in hindsight reveal how external pressure can distort investigative judgment. First, there was pure frustration after 2 years of intensive investigation with few concrete leads. Second, There was the growing belief that the crime had been committed by someone who knew Birgitte and the local areas intimately. Third, there were precedents of cases where close relatives had turned out to be guilty of crimes that initially seemed to have been committed by strangers. In January 1997, the cousin was summoned for what was described as a clarification session at the police station. He attended voluntarily, as he had done several times before, expecting to help in any way he could to find his cousin's killer. What he did not know was that this session would be fundamentally different from the previous ones. The interrogation team had decided to apply psychological pressure techniques that were controversial even by the standards of the time. They had studied interrogation manuals suggesting that guilty suspects could be induced to confess through a combination of confrontation, isolation, and the presentation of evidence that might be real or fabricated. The interrogation began familiarly, with routine questions about the cousin's movements on the night of the murder and his relationship with Birgitte. But gradually, the tone shifted. Investigators began suggesting inconsistencies in his previous statements, claiming new evidence had emerged implicating him and insisting it was in his best interest to tell the truth about what really happened that night. The cousin, confused and increasingly distressed, maintained his denials. He insisted he had nothing to hide and knew nothing beyond what he had already said about his cousin's death. But convinced they were on the right track, investigators escalated their approach. For 4 to 5 hours, the 19-year-old was subjected to what experts would later describe as a classic coercive interrogation. He was deprived of food and water, denied access to a lawyer, a practice unacceptable today, and was constantly confronted with claims that he was guilty of his cousin's murder.
The techniques included what psychologists call minimization, where investigators suggest the crime was understandable or justifiable under the circumstances. They suggested perhaps the cousin had tried to make romantic advances toward Birgitte and she rejected him, leading to a confrontation that spiraled out of control. They implied that if he confessed, he would be treated more leniently than if he continued to deny. Even more dangerously, they used maximization, exaggerating the consequences of not confessing and presenting fabricated scenarios of evidence allegedly proving his guilt. They claimed witnesses had seen him with Birgitte that night, false, that physical evidence connected him to the crime, false, and that it was only a matter of time before these evidences secured his conviction anyway. Under relentless psychological pressure, the cousin finally broke. Exhausted, confused, and convinced by investigators there was no way out, he eventually said what they wanted to hear. In a fragmented and often incoherent statement, he confessed to killing his cousin Birgitte. The confession was immediately treated as a major breakthrough by the investigation team. After nearly 2 years of frustration, they finally had a solution to one of Norway's most notorious recent crimes. Local police chief Karl-Henrik Sjursen issued a public statement expressing satisfaction that the family and the local community of Karmøy now have an answer to the murder mystery. But there were fundamental problems with the confession that should have been obvious to experienced investigators. First, many of the details he provided were factually incorrect or inconsistent with physical evidence. Second, he could not explain aspects of the crime that only the real killer could have known. Third, his demeanor during and after the confession was more consistent with someone saying what he thought they wanted to hear rather than someone relieved to finally admit the truth. More importantly, the confession had been obtained through methods violating standard procedures for criminal interrogations. The young man had been denied legal representation, subjected to extreme psychological pressure for hours, and confronted with false claims of evidence. By any objective standard, the confession should have been deemed unreliable. But the pressure for resolution was so intense that these problems were minimized or ignored. In March 1997, with much media fanfare,
Birgitte Tengs' cousin was formally charged with her murder. The trial that followed was a travesty of justice. The evidence against him consisted essentially of the coerced confession and vague circumstances about his family proximity to the victim. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, no eyewitnesses, and no clear motive. Yet, in a courtroom influenced by public pressure and confidence in police statements, he was convicted of his cousin's murder. The conviction was celebrated in the media as a victory of justice over crime. Finally, Birgitte Tengs could rest in peace, and her family could begin to heal. The Karmøy community collectively breathed a sigh of relief, believing the monster who had terrorized their small island had been caught. But this sense of closure was short-lived. Even as the cousin was taken to prison, voices began questioning the validity of his conviction. Police interrogation experts raised concerns about the methods used. Defense lawyers pointed out glaring inconsistencies. Psychologists warned of the dangers of false confessions induced by pressure. In 1998, just a year after his conviction, the cousin was acquitted by the Göttingen Court of Appeal. The higher court determined his confession had been obtained through improper methods and there was insufficient evidence to uphold a criminal conviction. He was released from prison and, theoretically, his innocence restored. But the saga did not end there. In a bizarre legal twist that still haunts Norway's justice system, although he was acquitted criminally, he was simultaneously ordered to pay compensation to Birgitte Tengs' parents in a civil lawsuit. The reasoning was that the standard of proof for civil liability is lower than for criminal conviction, a legal distinction that created the absurd situation where someone could be simultaneously innocent and guilty of the same crime. This contradictory decision haunted him for decades. Although legally innocent of his cousin's murder, he remained financially responsible for her death. The social stigma persisted, and many in the community continued to view him with suspicion. His life was destroyed by a mishandled investigation and a forced confession. But the system that had created this injustice offered no clear path to restitution. In 2003, the European Court of Human Rights intervened, condemning the Norwegian state for violating his rights through the contradictory civil decision. But even this international vindication could not undo the damage caused by years of public suspicion and being treated as a social outcast. For the Birgitte Tengs investigation, the false confession and wrongful conviction of her cousin represented a disaster extending far beyond the immediate damage to his personal life. Precious years were wasted pursuing the wrong person while the real killer remained free. Public trust in the justice system was severely damaged. More importantly, the flawed investigative techniques leading to the wrongful conviction set dangerous precedents influencing how future cases would be handled. As the years passed and it became increasingly clear that a terrible injustice had been committed, the Birgitte Tengs case became a study in the dangers of false confessions, the limitations of coercive interrogation techniques, and the importance of maintaining strict evidentiary standards even under intense pressure for results. But these lessons would be forgotten as a new generation of investigators faced similar pressures and committed similar mistakes decades later. The first major miscarriage of justice in the Birgitte Tengs case had set the precedent for a second, one that would be even more spectacular in its scope and in the advanced technologies it would misuse.
For Birgitte Tengs' cousin, the 1998 criminal acquittal should have marked a new beginning. At 20 years old, he had lost 2 years of his young life, first under suspicion, then in prison, and finally navigating the appeals process that restored his legal freedom. But legal freedom did not mean social or psychological freedom. Despite the acquittal, the shadow of suspicion never fully disappeared. Karmøy was a small community where everyone knew each other, and where memories ran long. Although the justice system had declared him innocent, many locals remained divided. Some accepted the court's verdict and recognized that a terrible injustice had been committed.
Others continued to suspect there was some truth to the original accusations, that perhaps he had escaped on legal technicalities. The contradictory civil ruling that forced him to pay compensation while being criminally innocent only further complicated his social situation. How could anyone understand a legal system that simultaneously declared him innocent and guilty? For many, the compensation ruling seemed to confirm that something had happened, even if it couldn't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Unable to rebuild a normal life in Karmøy, the cousin eventually made the painful decision to leave Norway altogether. He moved abroad, seeking anonymity and the chance to start over in a place where his name was not forever tied to one of the most notorious crimes in modern Norwegian history. It was a form of self-imposed exile, punishment for a crime he hadn't committed, born from an investigation that had failed spectacularly. Meanwhile, in Karmøy, life tried to return to normal, but never really could. The murder of Birgitte Tengs had permanently altered the island's psyche. The sense of safety that had characterized the community for generations was gone. Parents became more cautious with their teenage children. Young women avoided walking alone at night. A subtle yet persistent atmosphere of anxiety permeated everyday social interactions. For Birgitte's parents, Joachim and Ingrid Tengs, the years following the cousin's acquittal brought a different kind of torment. For 2 years, they had believed they knew who killed their daughter. While it didn't bring Birgitte back, it at least offered the feeling that justice had been served. Now, suddenly, they were back at the beginning, with a murdered daughter and no answers about who had taken her life. The cousin's eventual vindication through the European Court of Human Rights in 2003 brought a sense of restored justice, but also highlighted the magnitude of the errors committed. The Norwegian state was officially censured for its actions, ordered to pay substantial compensation, and forced to publicly acknowledge that a grave injustice had occurred. But acknowledging the error did not undo the damage caused, nor did it bring investigators closer to identifying the real killer. During these years of relative quiet in the Birgitte Tengs case, the world of forensic science was undergoing a revolution. DNA analysis, which had been in its infancy in 1995, was becoming increasingly sophisticated and powerful. New techniques were being developed to extract usable profiles from smaller and more degraded samples. DNA databases were expanding, allowing comparisons across national and temporal borders. In Britain, the United States, and other countries with advanced forensic systems, cold cases were being reopened and solved through these new technologies. Cold DNA, evidence collected years or decades ago, but unusable at the time, was providing leads in cases once considered unsolvable. These success stories did not go unnoticed in Norway. Within the Norwegian forensic community, there was growing discussion about the potential of reapplying modern technologies to old unsolved cases. The Birgitte Tengs case, with its carefully preserved 1995 samples, was frequently mentioned as a prime candidate for such a re-examination. But for years, these discussions remained just that, discussions. Resources were limited, technologies were still evolving, and questions about investigative priorities persisted. Active cases received precedence over decades-old mysteries. Birgitte Tengs' DNA evidence remained in refrigerated storage, waiting for the day when technology and political will would align to give it new life. In 2010, 15 years after the murder, there was an attempt to reopen the investigation using the DNA technologies then available. Samples were sent to specialized laboratories, analyses were conducted, but the results were inconclusive. The technology had improved, but not enough to extract a usable profile from the degraded 1995 samples. The case was once again shelved,
waiting for future advances. During these years, other developments were taking place that would eventually prove crucial to the revival of the Birgitte Tengs case. In 2008, Norway established the National Criminal Investigation Service, Kripos, consolidating forensic expertise and investigative resources that had previously been scattered across multiple agencies. Within Kripos, discussions began about creating a specialized unit dedicated exclusively to unsolved old cases, a cold case unit similar to those proving successful in other countries. The idea was simple but powerful. Instead of letting old cases languish in the archives, a dedicated team would systematically revisit unsolved investigations, apply modern technologies to old evidence, and potentially bring closure to families left without answers for decades. The Birgitte Tengs case was an obvious candidate for such a unit. It was highly publicized, physical evidence had been preserved, and the earlier wrongful conviction had created a particular sense of injustice demanding correction. More importantly, technological developments suggested that the 1995 samples could finally produce usable results. In January 2016, 21 years after Birgitte Tengs' murder, Kripos officially announced the establishment of its new cold case unit. In a highly symbolic decision, they chose the Birgitte Tengs case as their first official investigation. It was a clear message that Norway was committed to using its most advanced capabilities to solve its most persistent mysteries. The decision was widely covered in the Norwegian media and received significant public interest. For the Tengs family, it represented renewed hope after years of silence. For the Karmøy community, it offered the possibility of finally learning the truth about a crime that had defined their collective identity for more than 2 decades. For the Norwegian justice system, it was a chance to correct the mistakes of the past through the application of superior science. But there was also apprehension. 20 years of speculation, rumor, and suspicion had created a complex web of expectations and fears in the community. Some worried that reopening the investigation would only reopen old wounds. Others feared that new revelations could implicate innocent people or destroy reputations based on circumstantial evidence. For those who had lived through the injustices of the original investigation, there were understandable concerns about whether the same mistakes could be repeated even with better technology. The cousin's false confession had shown how pressure for results could lead to premature conclusions. Would there be adequate safeguards to prevent such errors this time? These concerns would prove prophetic. As the new investigation began, applying the most advanced forensic technologies in the world to 20-year-old evidence, investigators believed they finally had the tools to solve one of Norway's most persistent mysteries. What they could not foresee was that they were about to commit errors just as great as their predecessors, using superior science to reach equally flawed conclusions. The 20 years of silence were about to be broken, but the voices that emerged would tell a story of how even the most advanced technology can be corrupted by human bias, and how the pursuit of justice can paradoxically perpetuate injustice on an even greater scale.
The revival of the Birgitte Tengs investigation in 2016 coincided with a golden era in forensic science. DNA analysis had evolved dramatically since the early days of 1995, transforming from a rudimentary tool into a science of almost mathematical precision. For Kripos's cold case unit, the Tengs case represented the perfect opportunity to demonstrate how modern technology could finally solve mysteries that had persisted for decades. The first step was a complete re-evaluation of all physical evidence collected at the original crime scene. Birgitte Tengs' tights, carefully preserved in refrigerated storage for more than 2 decades, were analyzed using equipment unimaginable in 1995.
Advanced mass spectrometers, next-generation DNA amplification techniques, and purification methods capable of extracting genetic material from microscopic samples were all applied to biological traces collected decades earlier. But investigators quickly realized that even with superior technology, the 1995 samples posed significant challenges. 20 years of storage, even under controlled conditions, had caused some degradation. The samples were mixed with DNA from the victim herself, creating complex profiles that required sophisticated analysis to separate. More problematic, the amounts of material were extremely small, microscopic traces that tested the limits of even the most advanced technology. Faced with these challenges, Norwegian investigators made a decision that would prove crucial. They would expand their investigation beyond national capabilities, seeking out the best forensic specialists in the world to help decipher the old evidence. This decision led to the establishment of an unprecedented international collaboration involving 4 of the most advanced forensic laboratories in the world. The first partner was the Netherlands Forensic Institute in The Hague, widely considered one of the most technologically advanced forensic institutes in the world. Dutch specialists in degraded DNA analysis were tasked with attempting to extract usable profiles from the most challenging samples. Their facilities housed equipment worth millions of dollars, representing the state-of-the-art in DNA recovery. The second partner was Principal Forensic Services in the United Kingdom, led by Jonathan P. Whittaker, one of Europe's most respected forensic experts. Whittaker had worked on some of the most complex cases in British forensic history and brought decades of experience in handling challenging DNA evidence. The third collaborator was the Institute of Legal Medicine at the Medical University of Innsbruck, Austria, headed by Walther Parson. Parson was a pioneer in mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome analysis, specialties that would prove crucial to the Tengs case. His techniques could potentially extract genetic information from samples other methods deemed unusable. The fourth and perhaps most crucial partner was Aalborg University in Denmark, specifically the work of Mikkel Meyer Andersen in the Department of Mathematical Sciences. Andersen had developed groundbreaking mathematical models for interpreting complex DNA evidence, particularly Y chromosome analyses. His models could potentially quantify the rarity of DNA profiles with unprecedented accuracy. As Andersen would later explain, their work could reduce the number of possible perpetrators from perhaps several 100,000 to fewer than 100, and often much fewer. The analysis process took years. Between 2016 and 2019, Birgitte Tengs' samples traveled through the most advanced laboratories in Europe. At each stop, different techniques were applied, different angles were tested, and gradually a genetic profile began to emerge from the 23-year-old samples. The key was YSTR analysis, short tandem repeats on the Y chromosome that mutate rapidly and can provide highly specific genetic identities. Unlike ordinary Y chromosomes, which may be shared by many related men, rapidly mutating YSTRs can be unique to individuals or small family groups. It was exactly the type of evidence that could potentially solve a decades-old case. In 2019, the laboratories finally produced results that seemed revolutionary. They had managed to extract a usable YSTR profile from the 1995 samples, a profile that was extremely rare in the general population. Using Andersen's mathematical models, they calculated that perhaps only a few dozen men in all of Norway could potentially have this specific profile. But there was a problem. The profile did not match anyone in Norway's criminal databases. Whoever had left this DNA had not been convicted of crimes that required DNA collection. For investigators, this suggested they were looking for someone who could committed this terrible crime, but for some reason had avoided subsequent criminal detection. The solution came through the application of genetic genealogy, a technique that had recently revolutionized criminal case solving in the United States.
Instead of comparing the DNA profile only to criminal databases, investigators began searching for distant genetic relatives through public and commercial genealogical databases. This was the part of the investigation that truly highlighted the power of international collaboration. Specialized genealogists began constructing extensive family trees, tracing genetic lineages across multiple generations and national borders. They analyzed historical records, immigration documents, birth and death certificates, and gradually mapped out families potentially connected to the mysterious DNA profile. The work was extremely detailed and time-consuming. Every potential genetic connection had to be verified through independent records. Living individuals had to be contacted, and in some cases, persuaded to provide DNA samples for comparison. Family trees had to be built and verified through multiple sources. But gradually, a pattern emerged. The DNA profile appeared connected to specific families in the Rogaland region of western Norway, the same general area where Karmøy is located. More intriguingly, some of these families had historical connections to Karmøy dating back centuries. In 2020, after more than a year of intensive genealogical work, investigators finally narrowed their search to a small number of male candidates who were the right age to have committed the crime in 1995 and whose genetic backgrounds matched the mysterious profile. Among these candidates was a man who had lived in Karmøy throughout his adult life and who, crucially, had been on the police's radar since the original 1995 investigation. This man was Johnny Vassbakk, then 52 years old, who had worked in various jobs around the Karmøy area over the years. More significantly, police records show that he had been questioned as a witness during the original 1995 investigation, but had never been considered a serious suspect at the time. When investigators began to look more closely into Vassbakk's background, they uncovered information that seemed to confirm their new theory. Vassbakk had a criminal history that included multiple convictions for violence, sexual offenses, and theft of women's underwear during the 1990s and early 2000s. His pattern of criminal behavior seemed consistent with the type of person who could have committed the brutal attack on Birgitte Tengs. More disturbingly, records show that he had demonstrated specific predatory behavior toward teenage girls. He had been convicted of harassing a teenage girl by phone in 1994, just 1 year before Birgitte's murder. During this incident, he had posed as a 13-year-old boy to gain the young victim's trust. There was also evidence that his interest in teenagers had continued over the years. Investigators discovered he had used fake Facebook profiles to collect photographs of teenage girls and had given underwear to a 14-year-old girl he met through a telephone dating service. For investigators, these elements seemed to align perfectly. They had scientifically advanced DNA evidence pointing to an extremely rare individual. They had a suspect with a relevant criminal history and behavioral patterns consistent with the crime. They had geographic and temporal connections that made sense. After 25 years, it seemed they finally solved one of Norway's most persistent criminal mysteries. On September 1, 2021, while Johnny Vassbakk was on vacation in Farsund, southern Norway, he was arrested by police. The arrest was carefully coordinated, designed to minimize public drama while ensuring he could not escape or destroy evidence. For Vassbakk, who had lived a relatively quiet life for years, the arrest was a devastating shock. For investigators, it represented the culmination of years of meticulous scientific work. Technology had finally fulfilled its promise. Cutting-edge forensic science, international collaboration, and sophisticated mathematics had apparently solved a case that traditional techniques had failed to resolve for decades. It was an apparent triumph of scientific methodology over criminal mystery, a vindication of the belief that superior technology would inevitably lead to superior truth. But as subsequent events would prove, even the most advanced science in the world can be fatally corrupted when filtered through the lens of human bias and preconceived expectations. The very technology that seemed to offer unprecedented certainty, was about to demonstrate the most fundamental limits of scientific evidence when misinterpreted by investigators desperate for a solution.
Johnny Vasbach was 52 when his life took a dramatic turn on that September morning in 2021. A longtime resident of Karmøy, he had built a relatively stable routine after decades marked by legal troubles in his youth. He worked at a transport company, maintained cordial relations with neighbors, and had avoided serious criminal matters for more than 15 years. However, his past included incidents that, when examined during the reopened investigation, raised concerns about his behavior patterns. In the 1990s, around the time of Birgitte Tengs' murder, Vasbach already had a criminal record indicating problematic behavior. His convictions involved harassment and conduct that drew scrutiny from authorities at the time. One significant episode occurred in 1994, just a year before Birgitte's death. Vasbach was accused and convicted of repeatedly contacting a teenage girl through a popular telephone chat service of the era. He used a false identity to interact with her, an action that later investigators considered part of a pattern of deceptive behavior. At the same time, he was convicted of thefts and other offenses that suggested unusual compulsions, though not financially motivated. These actions showed repeated troubling tendencies in his early life. Even decades later, investigators found that some of Vasbach's online activities indicated a continued focus on behaviors that had previously led to convictions. During the trial, it became clear that he had maintained digital activity patterns that aligned with his past behavior. For investigators who had gathered DNA and other scientific evidence, these biographical details strengthened their certainty that they were examining the correct suspect. The evidence showed a combination of genetic and behavioral factors that connected him to the case under investigation.
The timing was particularly compelling. The phone harassment of 1994 occurred just months before Birgitte Tengs' death in May 1995. This suggested a possible escalation from non-physical harassment to lethal physical violence. It was exactly the type of progression criminologists often observed in offenders who were not stopped early enough. Perhaps even more significant was the fact that Vasbach had been on the police radar since the original investigation. Records showed that he had been questioned as a witness in 1995, but was apparently dismissed as a suspect at the time. For modern investigators, this suggested their predecessors may have let the true perpetrator slip right under their noses, while instead focusing on the innocent cousin through flawed interrogation techniques. Even more intriguing, multiple people had apparently contacted the police about Vasbach immediately after the original murder. Although the specific details of these early tips remained unclear, their existence suggested that some in the community had considered Vasbach a plausible suspect from the very beginning. Perhaps there had been solid investigative instincts in 1995 that were overshadowed by the pressure for quick results and improper methods. When Vasbach was finally arrested in September 2021, his reaction was consistent with someone who knew this moment might eventually come. According to his lawyer, Stian Christensen, Vasbach became deeply distressed and began crying for a long time when he was informed of the formal charges. Christensen described him as being in a nightmare from which he hoped to awake but could not. This emotional reaction was interpreted differently by different observers. For the prosecution, it looked consistent with someone who knew he had finally been caught for a crime committed decades earlier. For the defense, it looked more like the response of an innocent man confronted with devastating accusations based on evidence he could neither explain nor contest. Vasbach's arrest sent shockwaves through Karmøy, a community that had lived with the mystery of Birgitte Tengs for more than a quarter century. For many residents, there was a sense of relief mixed with apprehension. Finally, it seemed, there was an answer to the question that had haunted their island for decades.
But there was also caution born from the memory of how wrong investigators had been with the cousin 2 decades earlier. For the Tengs family, the arrest represented renewed hope, but also cautious optimism tempered by the experience of earlier false hopes. They had once believed they knew who had killed their daughter, only to discover they had been wrong. This time, they were more guarded in their public statements, waiting to see how the case would unfold in court. Norwegian media covered the arrest extensively, but with more nuance and care than had characterized the coverage of the original investigation. There was growing awareness of the dangers of trial by media and a collective memory of how irresponsible coverage had contributed to the cousin's wrongful conviction decades earlier. Internationally, the case drew significant attention within the forensic community. The combination of cutting-edge DNA techniques, international laboratory collaboration, and the application of genetic genealogy represented a case study in how modern technology could solve crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. Conferences were organized to discuss the methods used, and academic papers began to be written analyzing the scientific approaches employed. But there were also voices of caution within the scientific community. Some experts warned that the apparent precision of modern DNA analysis could create a false sense of certainty that might lead investigators to overlook alternative explanations or inconvenient inconsistencies. The history of forensic science is filled with techniques that seemed revolutionary when first introduced, only to later reveal serious limitations or potential for misinterpretation. These concerns would prove prescient. As the case against Vosbach began to take shape, it became increasingly clear that even the most sophisticated science could fall victim to the same human biases that had plagued the original investigation. Technology had changed dramatically in the quarter-century since Birgitte Tengs' murder, but the human tendency to see patterns where none existed and to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirmed pre-existing beliefs remained frustratingly constant. The stage was now set for what many believed would be the final chapter in one of Norway's most persistent criminal mysteries. Advanced science, international collaboration, and seemingly ironclad evidence appeared to guarantee a conviction that would finally deliver justice for Birgitte Tengs. That the same confident assumptions had been made before, with devastating consequences for innocent people, was a lesson that apparently still needed to be learned again.
In February 2023, the Haugaland and Sunnhordland District Court in the city of Haugesund prepared to host what many considered Norway's most significant criminal trial in decades. The state versus Johnny Vosbach represented not only a potential resolution to one of the country's most persistent criminal mysteries, but also a test of the most advanced forensic science available in the world. The prosecution, led by experienced statsadvokat Tale Tomseth, had spent months preparing a case they believed to be virtually irrefutable. At the heart of their argument was DNA evidence developed through years of sophisticated international scientific analysis. But their strategy extended well beyond forensics, presenting a detailed portrait of Vosbach's behavioral history, one that, they argued, revealed his propensity for exactly the type of crime that had cost Birgitte Tengs her life. The defense, headed by seasoned lawyers Stian Christensen and Stian Brostein, faced a task that seemed almost impossible. How could they contest scientific evidence developed by some of the world's most respected forensic experts, using technologies that represented the state-of-the-art in DNA analysis? Their strategy would necessarily focus not on challenging science itself, but rather the interpretation and application of that science to the specific circumstances of the Tengs case. The trial opened with great media fanfare and substantial public interest. Norwegian courtrooms had rarely seen such an array of international experts summoned to testify on a single piece of evidence. The presence of renowned forensic scientists from multiple countries gave the proceedings an aura of scientific authority that seemed to place the outcome beyond reasonable doubt. Among the first expert witnesses called by the prosecution was Mikkel Meyer Andersen of Aalborg University. His testimony detailed the mathematical models he had developed to interpret YSTR DNA profiles and how these models were applied to the genetic material extracted from Birgitte Tengs' tights. Using complex statistical calculations, he demonstrated that the probability of finding a random match for the specific YSTR profile discovered in the evidence was astronomically low. With this new method, Andersen testified, we can help the court by narrowing down the number of possible perpetrators from perhaps several 100,000 to under 100, and often even fewer. His calculations showed that only a few dozen men in all of Norway could potentially possess the rare genetic profile matching the DNA evidence. Jonathan Whitaker from Principal Forensic Services in the United Kingdom testified about the advanced techniques used to extract usable DNA profiles from the degraded 1995 samples. He explained how modern technology could recover genetic material from microscopic traces that would have been unusable a decade earlier, and how international collaboration allowed multiple complementary methods to confirm the findings. Walter Parson from the Institute of Legal Medicine at the Medical University of Innsbruck described the Y chromosome analysis techniques that had been crucial in isolating male DNA from mixed samples. He explained how rapidly mutating YSTRs created genetic signatures far more specific than traditional Y chromosome markers, essentially forming genetic fingerprints that could pinpoint individuals rather than broad family groups. Representatives from the Netherlands Forensics Institute testified about their extensive efforts to verify and validate the DNA findings using independent techniques. They explained how multiple laboratories working separately had reached the same conclusions, providing a level of scientific confidence that transcended any single institution's capabilities.
This display of international expertise made a powerful impression in the courtroom. It involved scientific evidence validated and cross-checked by some of the world's most advanced forensic institutions. The methodologies used represented the cutting edge of genetic analysis, and the conclusions appeared supported by solid and indisputable mathematical foundations. However, the prosecution's case went far beyond DNA. Tom Seth and her team presented a detailed biographical portrait of Vassbach, highlighting patterns of concerning behavior from his past that were relevant to the ongoing investigation. During the trial, experts presented analyses of past behavioral patterns that could indicate risks in certain situations. Other previous incidents were mentioned to illustrate behavioral consistency and support the investigation. A significant point emphasized by the prosecution was that multiple people had contacted the police with information about Vassbach shortly after the original events. Although these early reports were not fully investigated at the time, their existence showed that suspicion of Vassbach had existed within the community from the outset. This is not a case where science identified a random suspect, argued Tom Seth in her opening statement. This is a case where scientific investigation complements evidence that has existed for decades, providing consistent information to clarify the facts. The prosecution also highlighted geographic and temporal connections. Vassbach lived in the area at the time, knew the region well, and displayed behaviors consistent with the context of the investigation. When combined with scientific evidence, these circumstantial elements formed a robust set of proof. For weeks, experts reinforced different aspects of the case. DNA analysts explained extraction techniques. Mathematicians presented statistical probabilities.
Genealogists showed how family trees helped narrow potential suspects, and behavioral specialists outlined how certain patterns aligned with the profile being investigated. The cumulative effect was impressive. By the time the prosecution rested its case, it appeared that not only a preponderance of evidence had been presented, but a highly consistent scientific demonstration. The combination of advanced forensic science, international expert validation, behavioral consistency, and community suspicion created a case that went beyond normal standards of reasonable doubt. When the verdict was delivered in February 2023, few were surprised. The court unanimously found Johnny Vosbach guilty. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison, a substantial penalty reflecting both the seriousness of the case and the court's confidence that the scientific evidence had established responsibility. The conviction was widely celebrated as a triumph of forensic science in solving criminal mysteries. International media highlighted how modern technology and collaboration had finally resolved a case that had persisted for decades. Within scientific circles, the case became an example of the power of advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy in complex investigations. For the victim's family, the conviction represented a form of closure they had waited nearly 30 years to achieve, finally bringing a sense of justice and clarity. For the local community, there was relief that a long-standing mystery had been resolved and that the responsible party was being held accountable. For Vosbach himself, however, the conviction was a shock. Court observers reported that he had to be removed from the courtroom after the verdict was read. His reaction indicated the impact of facing the consequences of a complex and detailed investigation. His lawyers immediately announced their intention to appeal, but few believed in the possibility of success. How could a conviction based on sophisticated evidence, validated by so many international experts, be overturned? The DNA analyses had been conducted by multiple laboratories, all reaching the same conclusions, and the statistical analyses appeared mathematically consistent. The behavioral evidence formed a coherent pattern that reinforced the scientific findings. However, as subsequent events would show, even the most advanced science can have limitations when interpreted without sufficient consideration of alternative explanations. The extreme confidence in scientific precision that had supported the prosecution's case demonstrated that even robust evidence can be challenged when applied by humans to complex, real-world cases.
In December 2023, the Gulating Court of Appeal in Stavanger was preparing to revisit the Birgitte Tengs case under circumstances few had anticipated. What was expected to be a mere formality, the routine confirmation of a conviction based on seemingly irrefutable scientific evidence, was about to turn into one of the most shocking and critical verdicts in modern Norwegian judicial history. The defense strategy for the appeal had been fundamentally reorganized since the original trial. Instead of simply challenging the existing evidence, Christensen and Brostein had commissioned their own independent forensic analyses, exploring possibilities the original investigation had failed to properly consider. The turning point came when the defense team succeeded in having new analyses conducted by the Netherlands Forensic Institute, ironically the same laboratory that had supplied key evidence for the original prosecution. On August 28, 2023, just days before the appeal began, the Dutch experts were tasked with analyzing 2 microdrops on Birgitte Tengs' tights that had not been fully examined during the original investigation. The results of these new analyses were nothing short of revolutionary. In one microdrop, scientists identified DNA that could potentially be linked to Vosbach, consistent with earlier findings. But in the other sample, they made a discovery that would completely change the case narrative. DNA that could belong to one of the last people to see Birgitte Tengs alive. This DNA belonged to a 17-year-old friend of Birgitte, who had testified during the original 1995 investigation. He told investigators that he met Birgitte on Kopervik's main street the night of her death and gave her a friendly hug, a casual gesture between young people who had known each other since childhood. Almost 30 decades later, that innocent hug had left genetic traces that offered a crucial alternative explanation for the presence of male DNA on the victim's clothing. The discovery was devastating to the prosecution's theory. If DNA could be transferred through a casual hug, followed by Birgitte possibly touching her face and then her clothes, then the presence of male DNA on the tights did not necessarily indicate direct contact during the crime. It was possible, perhaps even likely, that genetic material could have been transferred through complex sequences of indirect contact that had nothing to do with the murder itself. But the revelations didn't stop there. The analysis also uncovered DNA from a crime technician who had examined the tights during the original 1995 investigation. This discovery highlighted systemic problems with evidence handling protocols in the 1990s, when proper protective equipment was not always used consistently. Cross-contamination that had occurred decades earlier was now providing further evidence of how complex and unreliable interpretations of DNA transfer could be. Most significantly for the case against Vosbach, these new findings demonstrated that multiple people had left DNA traces on Birgitte's clothing through various mechanisms. Vosbach's DNA was neither unique nor exclusive. It was just one among several genetic sources deposited on the same garments through means ranging from direct contact to technical contamination. When these new findings were presented to the appellate court, the impact was immediate and dramatic. The judges began questioning not only the specific evidence against Vosbach, but the entire investigative methodology that had led to his conviction.
The judicial criticism focused on something forensic experts had long known, but investigators often ignored: the crucial difference between source-level DNA evidence and activity-level DNA evidence. Source-level evidence can establish that a particular person left genetic material in a specific place, but activity-level evidence requires interpretation of how and when that material was deposited. And it is in this interpretation that human bias can distort scientific conclusions. The court concluded that the investigation had fallen into the confirmation trap, a cognitive bias in which investigators interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirm their pre-existing theories, while ignoring or minimizing alternative explanations. Once Vosbach had become a suspect based on the DNA profile, every other aspect of the case was viewed through that lens of suspicion. His criminal record, instead of being independent evidence of guilt, was reinterpreted as consistent with the theory that he was the killer. His presence in the local community, rather than being a normal geographic coincidence, was framed as opportunity access. His denial of knowing Birgitte, instead of being potentially truthful, was treated as an attempted cover-up. Most damagingly, the investigation had failed to adequately consider alternative explanations for DNA transfer. Investigators had become so focused on building a case against Vosbach that they neglected to systematically explore how his DNA could have ended up on Birgitte's clothing through indirect means. The appellate court was particularly critical of the prosecution's over-reliance on statistical evidence about the rarity of Vosbach's YSTR profile. While the mathematical calculations were technically correct, they were fundamentally irrelevant if the DNA had been deposited through indirect transfer rather than direct contact during the crime. That something is possible is not the same as something being proven, the judges wrote in their verdict. This seemingly simple observation underscored a fundamental problem with how advanced forensic evidence was being interpreted in legal contexts. Mathematical sophistication had created an illusion of certainty that obscured basic uncertainties about interpretation. The court also sharply criticized the way the prosecution had presented behavioral evidence about Vosbach's past.
While his criminal history was factually accurate, the judges determined it had been misused to create a narrative of guilt that was not properly supported by direct evidence connecting him to Birgitte's murder. The final decision was devastating in both scope and language. In a 5-2 ruling, the Gulenton Court of Appeal not only acquitted Johnny Vosbach, but delivered one of the harshest rebukes to prosecutors and investigators in modern Norwegian legal history. The court cannot rely on speculation, declared the presiding judge. The prosecution fell into the so-called confirmation trap. They misinterpreted evidence, promoted indefensible claims, and engaged in pure speculation. Legal commentators noted they had never seen a judicial verdict that so strongly criticized the police and prosecutors. The language was so severe that an editorial in Bergens Tidende suggested that the prosecution should simply curl up in the fetal position and cry. For Johnny Vosbach, who had fainted when initially convicted, the acquittal brought an equally intense emotional release. He broke down in tears as the verdict was read, and his lawyers immediately announced plans to seek substantial compensation from the Norwegian state for the more than 2 years he had spent in prison for a crime he did not commit. The public reaction to the acquittal was one of shock and disbelief. How could scientific evidence that seemed so convincing have been so thoroughly discredited? How could international experts using the most advanced technologies available have reached conclusions later dismissed as speculation? The answer lay in the fundamental difference between scientific capability and scientific interpretation. The technology used in the investigation was genuinely advanced, the laboratories truly world-class, and the mathematical calculations technically correct. But all that technical sophistication had been applied within an interpretive framework fatally compromised by confirmation bias. The case exposed an uncomfortable truth about modern forensic science, that the apparent objectivity of numbers and statistics can mask fundamental subjective judgments about what those numbers actually mean. The rarity of a genetic profile is mathematically calculable, but its relevance to establishing guilt depends on interpretations about how and when the material was deposited. Interpretations far more subjective than is often acknowledged. For the international scientific community that had celebrated the case as a demonstration of modern forensics power, the acquittal was deeply unsettling. It raised fundamental questions about how DNA evidence should be interpreted, how confirmation bias could be avoided, and what safeguards were necessary when powerful technologies were applied to criminal investigations. More broadly, the case underscored the dangers of over-reliance on any single form of evidence, no matter how sophisticated. International scientific collaboration, advanced mathematical calculations, and cutting-edge technologies had created an illusion of infallibility that had overshadowed the need for basic scientific skepticism and consideration of alternative explanations. As news of the acquittal spread across international forensic communities, it served as a sobering reminder that even the most advanced science remains vulnerable to the same human biases that have plagued criminal investigations for centuries. Technology had changed dramatically since 1995, but the human tendency to see patterns where none existed and to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirmed pre-existing beliefs remained frustratingly constant. For Birgitte Tengs, whose murder had now produced 2 wrongful convictions over nearly 3 decades, the pursuit of justice seemed further away than ever.
The acquittal of Johanny Vosbach in December 2023 did not mark the end of his ordeal, but rather the beginning of a new, painful chapter in a life devastated by more than 2 years of imprisonment for a crime he did not commit. At 55 years old, he emerged from prison fundamentally changed, carrying psychological scars that no amount of compensation could fully heal.
During his 2 years and 3 months of incarceration, Vosbach had lost not only his freedom, but also his job, his income, and his reputation in the community where he had lived his entire adult life. The stigma of being accused of one of Norway's most notorious crimes extended far beyond the prison walls, affecting not only him, but also members of his family who had been subjected to public scrutiny and social isolation. The damage went well beyond the personal. During the trial and its aftermath, Vosbach had been subjected to what his lawyers described as a social media trial, where his photograph, name, and personal details were widely circulated online. Facebook groups, Instagram threads, Snapchat posts, and Jodel messages became vehicles for wild speculation and, in many cases, direct condemnation of a man who had not yet been legally convicted. This experience of being digitally cancelled before due process represented a particularly cruel new dimension of how high-profile criminal cases were now experienced by suspects. Unlike earlier eras, when public suspicion could be limited to local communities, the social media age had created an environment in which accusations could spread instantly across global networks, producing court of public opinion verdicts virtually impossible to reverse even when official legal decisions were overturned. In June 2025, Vosbach submitted a compensation claim for 20 million Norwegian kroner, approximately $2 million to the Norwegian state. The document, obtained by the media, outlined a devastating catalog of damages that went well beyond the simple loss of freedom. The claim detailed how Vosbach had lost not only income during his imprisonment, but also future earning capacity due to reputational harm. Employers were reluctant to hire someone whose name was permanently associated with the Birgitte Tengs case, even after his acquittal. His financial situation had deteriorated to the point where he relied on state assistance, a particularly bitter fall from grace for someone who had worked steadily throughout his adult life. More disturbing were the psychological harms described in the claim. Psychiatric reports documented symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, severe depression, and chronic anxiety resulting from his incarceration and public scrutiny. Vosbach had developed agoraphobia, making it difficult for him to leave his home or interact normally with neighbors and acquaintances. Perhaps most frustrating for Vosbach was the time it took to process his compensation claim. More than a year and a half after his acquittal, he had still not received a single payment. The Norwegian Civil Administration explained that it was processing claims submitted in 2023 and that his claim, filed in October 2024, would not be considered until earlier cases were resolved. This administrative delay represented an additional punishment for someone who had already suffered tremendously due to systemic failures in the justice system. Stian Christensen, one of Vosbach's lawyers, called the situation completely unacceptable, noting that his client was essentially being punished twice, first for wrongful imprisonment and then for bureaucratic indifference to his plight. The irony of the situation was not lost on observers. While the state had readily found resources to pursue Vosbach through years of expensive international investigation and high-profile trial, it appeared far less eager to provide remedies when those efforts proved fundamentally flawed. Meanwhile, for Birgitte Tengs' cousin, Vosbach's acquittal brought a form of final vindication decades in the making. In October 2024, it was announced that he had reached a settlement with the Norwegian Ministry of Justice, receiving 26 million kroner, or approximately $2.6 million, for compensation for years of being treated as a suspected killer despite his legal innocence. This settlement represented not only financial restitution, but also official acknowledgement by the Norwegian state that terrible injustices had been committed.
The cousin, now approaching middle age, had finally received formal recognition that he had been victimized not only by circumstance, but also by systematic failures in the criminal justice system.
For the Karmøy community, Vosbak's acquittal created even more confusion and frustration. For nearly 3 decades, residents had lived with the knowledge that Birgitte Tengs' killer remained among them, or at least had once lived among them. They had experienced false hope twice, first with the conviction of her cousin, and then with Vosbak's conviction. Now they were back where they had started in 1995, with a murdered girl and no answers. The psychological toll on a small community could not be underestimated. Residents who had felt relief when suspects were arrested now had to grapple with the reality that their justice system had failed spectacularly, not once, but twice. Trust in law enforcement, forensic science, and legal processes had been severely damaged. Local officials tried to provide leadership during this difficult period. Karmøy Mayor Leif Arne Marhaug made public appeals for residents to treat Vosbak as acquitted and innocent, but such official statements could not easily overcome decades of suspicion and social division. For the international forensic science community, the Vosbak reversal created a reckoning that extended far beyond a single case. Scientific journals began publishing analyses of what had gone wrong, and conferences were organized to discuss how similar mistakes might be avoided in the future. The consensus that emerged was that the case demonstrated fundamental problems not with forensic technology itself, but with how that technology was being interpreted and applied. Advanced DNA analysis, mathematical modeling, and international collaboration had all performed exactly as designed. The problem had been human. Investigators had allowed confirmation bias to guide their interpretation of scientific findings, leading to conclusions that seemed scientifically precise but were actually based on flawed reasoning. Several key lessons emerged from postmortem analyses of the case. First, no matter how sophisticated, DNA evidence requires careful interpretation that considers alternative explanations for how genetic material might have been deposited. The presence of someone's DNA at a crime scene establishes contact, not necessarily guilt. Second, statistical calculations about genetic rarity, while mathematically correct, can be misleading if applied without proper consideration of context. A rare genetic profile is only evidentially relevant if it was deposited through direct contact during a criminal act. Third, behavioral evidence and criminal history, while potentially relevant, should not be allowed to drive interpretation of ambiguous physical evidence. Past behavior can inform investigative directions, but should not be used to justify conclusions not adequately supported by direct evidence. Fourth, international collaboration and technological sophistication, while valuable, do not protect against confirmation bias if all participating institutions are operating within the same flawed interpretive framework. These lessons were incorporated into new training programs for forensic scientists and investigators throughout Europe and beyond. The Birgitte Tengs case became a standard case study in programs dedicated to teaching proper interpretation of DNA evidence and avoiding cognitive biases in criminal investigations. But perhaps most importantly, the case highlighted a fundamental tension within modern criminal justice between public expectation of scientific certainty and the more nuanced reality of how forensic evidence actually works. Popular culture, through television shows and media coverage, had created expectations that DNA analysis could provide definitive answers to complex questions. In reality, forensic science often provided probabilistic information that required careful interpretation within broader contexts. For Birgitte Tengs herself, whose murder had now generated 2 wrongful convictions over nearly 3 decades, the question of justice remained frustratingly elusive. Her parents, Joachim and Ingrid Tengs, had lived through multiple cycles of hope and disappointment, always believing that each new investigation would finally provide answers that had been so long delayed. The tragedy of her case extended beyond a single murdered girl to encompass systematic failures of institutions meant to protect society and deliver justice.
Two innocent men had had their lives severely damaged by overzealous prosecutions based on flawed interpretation of evidence. A community had been traumatized repeatedly by false promises of resolution. International scientific collaboration had been misapplied in ways that discredited forensic methodologies that were genuinely valuable when properly used. Most painfully, after 28 years, Birgitte Tengs' actual killer remained unknown and unpunished. A sophisticated investigation that had cost millions of dollars and involved some of the world's most advanced forensic laboratories had ultimately brought investigators no closer to answering a fundamental question: who killed a 17-year-old girl in May 1995? The answer to that question remained elusive, hidden somewhere within a web of evidence, speculation, scientific analysis, and human fallibility that had proven resistant even to the most advanced investigative techniques. The story of Birgitte Tengs' murder had become something larger than a single criminal case. It had become a parable about the limitations of human knowledge, the dangers of overconfidence in technological solutions, and the fundamental challenges of distinguishing between correlation and causation in complex real-world situations. For those who continued to search for answers, it served as a sobering reminder that some questions might be more difficult to answer than even the most advanced scientific methods could resolve. But it also demonstrated the importance of maintaining humility and skepticism when interpreting evidence, no matter how sophisticated the techniques used to generate it.
In June 2025, 30 years after the murder of Birgitte Tengs, her grave at Karmøy Cemetery remains a silent reminder not only of a young life tragically cut short, but also of how the pursuit of justice can sometimes perpetuate injustice on an even larger scale. Fresh flowers still appear regularly at the site, left by people who never knew Birgitte, but were moved by a story that transcended its original circumstances to become something far greater. The Birgitte Tengs case evolved from a local criminal mystery into a modern parable about the limits of scientific knowledge and the dangers of technological hubris. It represents one of the most spectacular failures in the application of forensic science in modern history. Not because the technology failed, but because the humans interpreting it allowed cognitive biases to corrupt even the most sophisticated data. What makes the case particularly disturbing is that every phase of the investigation employed what were considered the best practices of its time. The original 1995 investigation used the forensic technologies available then and followed standard interrogation procedures widely accepted. The 2016 to 2021 reinvestigation employed cutting-edge international scientific collaboration, involving some of the world's most respected forensic laboratories using state-of-the-art technologies. In both instances, investigators genuinely believed they were applying superior science to achieve superior truth. In both instances, they were tragically mistaken. The lesson is not that forensic science is inadequate, but that even the most advanced science remains vulnerable to the same human fallibilities that have plagued the search for truth throughout history. The concept of confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret information in ways that confirm pre-existing beliefs, proved more powerful than international collaboration, sophisticated mathematical analysis, or advanced forensic technologies. Once investigators became convinced of the cousin's guilt in 1997, or Vosbach's guilt in 2021, every subsequent piece of evidence was filtered through the lens of that initial conviction. This dynamic highlighted a crucial distinction often obscured in discussions of forensic evidence: the difference between technical capability and human interpretation. The DNA technologies used in the Tengs case worked exactly as designed. The mathematical calculations were technically correct. The international collaboration was genuinely cooperative. Yet all these technical elements were applied within interpretive frameworks fundamentally compromised by incorrect assumptions about what the data meant. The case also revealed how the apparent objectivity of numbers and statistics can create a false sense of certainty that obscures essential subjective judgments.
The rarity of a YSTR profile can be calculated with high precision, but the relevance of that rarity to determining guilt depends on interpretations of how and when the genetic material was deposited, interpretations far more subjective than generally acknowledged. For the international scientific community, the Birgitte Tengs case became a mandatory case study on the dangers of allowing technological sophistication to replace basic critical thinking. Training programs worldwide now use the case to illustrate how even the most advanced methods can produce erroneous conclusions when applied without adequate safeguards against cognitive bias. The implications extend well beyond forensic science to any field where complex data must be interpreted by humans. The case demonstrates that methodological sophistication alone does not guarantee superior outcomes if interpretive processes remain compromised by incorrect assumptions about what the data meant. For the Norwegian justice system, the case forced a fundamental re-evaluation of how scientific evidence is presented and interpreted in courts. New guidelines were developed emphasizing the importance of considering alternative explanations for forensic findings, and training programs were implemented to help judges and lawyers better understand both the capabilities and limitations of modern forensic science. Perhaps the most important lesson of the case, however, is a lesson in humility. In our era of rapid technological advances and expanding scientific capabilities, it is tempting to believe that complex problems will inevitably yield to superior methods. The Birgitte Tengs case demonstrates that some mysteries may resist solution even beyond the reach of our most sophisticated tools. This is not an argument against scientific investigation or technological development. On the contrary, it is an argument for applying these powerful tools with greater humility, skepticism, and appreciation for their limits. Forensic science has genuinely revolutionized criminal investigation and will continue to do so. But its application must always be tempered by the recognition that scientific data require human interpretation, and human interpretation remains prone to error. For Johnny Vasbach, still awaiting full compensation for the 2 years and 3 months he spent imprisoned for a crime he did not commit, the case represents a devastating personal reminder of how systemic failures can destroy individual lives. His experience serves as a microcosm of the human costs when powerful institutions apply sophisticated tools in inadequately considered ways. For Birgitte Tengs' cousin, whose life was equally devastated by a prior flawed investigation, eventual vindication arrived after decades of unnecessary suffering. His experience demonstrates how injustices can persist for years before being corrected, and how the burden of proving innocence can be unfairly placed on those wrongfully accused. For Birgitte Tengs' family, the case represents 3 decades of frustrated hope and unfulfilled promises. They experienced multiple cycles of believing they would finally have answers, only to discover they were back where they started. Their experience illustrates how justice system failures victimize not only the wrongly accused, but also the families of those truly harmed. For the Karmøy community, the case became a defining feature of its collective identity, albeit in no way anyone would have chosen. For 30 decades, residents lived with the knowledge that a killer remained among them, experiencing repeated false hope when suspects were arrested, only to have that hope dashed when convictions were overturned. More broadly, the case serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing public pressure and media expectations to influence investigative processes. In both wrongful conviction cases, investigators were under intense pressure to produce results, contributing to poor decision-making and hasty interpretations of ambiguous evidence. The case also highlights the importance of maintaining perspective on what justice truly means. Justice for Birgitte Tengs cannot be achieved by convicting innocent people, no matter how satisfying such convictions may initially appear to those seeking closure.
True justice requires not only identifying the right person, but doing so through processes that respect the rights of all individuals involved. As the case approaches its 30-year mark, the haunting question remains unanswered. Who really killed a bright 17-year-old girl on a May evening in 1995? Sophisticated forensic analysis, international collaboration, mathematical modeling, and genealogical research all failed to provide a definitive answer to this seemingly simple question. This failure should not be seen as an indictment of scientific methodology itself, but rather as a reminder of the complexity of real-world situations and the limitations of human knowledge. Some questions may be more difficult to answer than even our most advanced methods can resolve. Accepting this reality while continuing to search for truth through rigorous means represents a mature approach to both scientific inquiry and criminal justice. The legacy of the Birgitte Tengs case ultimately transcends its origins as a single criminal investigation. It has become a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, and a reminder of both the power and the limitations of modern forensic science. Most importantly, it serves as an ongoing call for humility, skepticism, and careful thinking in all endeavors where humans must interpret complex information to make consequential decisions. The truth about who killed Birgitte Tengs may never be known, but the lessons learned from 30 years of searching for that truth have value far beyond a single case. They remind us that the pursuit of knowledge and justice is an ongoing process requiring constant vigilance against the human tendency to see patterns where none exist and to interpret ambiguous information in ways that confirm what we already know we know. In this sense, Birgitte Tengs' legacy is not only as a crime victim, but also as a teacher whose case continues to educate others about both the possibilities and perils of modern forensic science. Her story demonstrates that even in an age of technological marvels, some of the most important tools for finding truth remain timeless. Careful observation, critical thinking, intellectual humility, and a willingness to acknowledge when we simply do not know the answer to a question, no matter how badly we want to know.
This case shows that even the world's most advanced technology can fail when influenced by human bias. If this story made you question how scientific justice really works, leave a like, share, and subscribe for more investigations that challenge our certainties. In the comments, tell us, do you believe we will ever know who really killed Birgitte Tengs? How can we better protect against these types of judicial errors in the future? Until the next mystery, where we continue exploring the fine line between science and speculation in the search for truth.